Oh, good afternoon. It's me again, George DeWars, reading from my little book, Getting at 8 Facts That Fuel Recovery, if we face them. Today, I'm going to record chapter 2. Let me show you the picture because there's an illustration here and a quote. That's the illustration. And in case you didn't see it, the word above that the guy's pulling the plug on the lamp of, the word says experience. The quote is from a certain blue book, sometimes referred to as the AA Big Book. Quote, "We are unable at certain times to bring into consciousness with sufficient force the memory of the suffering, ... It's on page 24. So the chapter is called, Oops, I Forgot. Some of you may be old enough to remember the Smothers Brothers. Or maybe you've watched them more recently on YouTube. Tom and Dickie were folk singers who became more of a comedy act. Tom played the straight-laced one and Dickie acted the doofus. In one of their skits, Tom plays a judge. He scolds defendant Dickie, reminding him that robbing banks is against the law. Dickie's sincere and wide-eyed response, "Why, gee, I forgot, Your Honor." The AA Big Book does not say that picking up the first drink is a felony. What it does say is this, full quote, "We are unable at certain times to bring into consciousness with sufficient force the memory of the suffering and humiliation of even a week or a month ago. We are without defense against the first drink." In other words, we may remember some of the pain that got us to quit drinking or drugging or whatever we're addicted to, but the memory isn't clear and strong enough to prevent us from starting again. This usually happens when things have gotten a lot better than they were the day that we quit. People sometimes say in meetings, "No one comes in here on a winning streak." You might just as well add, "But many of us go out on one." This report about the, quote, force of memory, unquote, is the sad experience of those who wrote it, the report in the Big Book. It is also a general observation about themselves as relapsing alcoholics. It means they step back from their own experience enough to see it from the outside. It's hard to see a solution if you can't see the problem. The more clearly you see the problem, the more likely a solution will take shape. Their statement is an observable fact, often witnessed by those of us who would help, whether we are counselors or fellow sufferers, like sponsors. There's no mention here of God or higher power. It is something simpler, an insight of and a lament by people who have tried repeatedly to stay sober and are baffled by their own failure. The force of memory quote is one of the few declarations in the Big Book placed in italics. Bill W. and his anonymous co-authors obviously thought it was important. Your humble servant would humbly submit that it is one of the 2 or 3 most important statements ever made about addictions of any kind. I'm not sure when I first got this as a counselor. I do remember working at the VA from 1977 to 1984 and having a group of men who came every Tuesday night. I could still tell you most of their names, including the one who died of congestive heart failure while avoiding the cancer diagnosis he dreaded but did not have. He's in the other book. And the veteran who was amazed we relieved his neck spasms with a bit of role-playing, only to hang himself a year or 2 later. I can still name 2 men who admitted to me that they did not come to group each week just for therapy. What really brought them back, they said, was a chance to look in on detox, specifically to be reminded where they came from, to be reminded why they were not taking the first drink today. Another memory for me comes much later, after I had started working the steps for myself. We were at an open breakfast meeting in Bellevue, Washington. A man with double-digit sobriety, sponsoring and being sponsored, shared why he still came to meetings. He would forget why he was not drinking if he stayed away. My memory and his name are so clear and detailed that this must have been a moment of realization for me. I finally connected his awareness of his memory issue to the motivation for attending meetings. He knew he had a problem remembering, and he was there to solve it. Fact faced, willingness found, action taken. Just by sitting there at the table eating scrambled eggs. Certainly, I had heard for years about the built-in forgetter, but I had abstained from my particular poison for years without meetings. It did not occur to me that I was getting daily reminders from the whole range of addictions and compulsions in my office. I realize now, of course, meetings remind us of other important things, not just the hazards of the first whatever. One of the best things I ever heard in a meeting was this: those who don't keep coming back to meetings don't get to hear what happens to people who don't keep coming back to meetings. Since then, I've heard a number of people, usually people with double-digit sobriety, confirm that they came to meetings because their memories were not to be trusted. Yet nowhere in the big book does it say this: come to meetings to refresh your built-in forgetter. Your life depends on it. Chapter 3 goes straight to the plain insanity of the first drink, to, quote, failure to enlarge our spiritual life. There is, in fact, a connection. Spirituality is nothing if not an increased ability to live in the present moment, to see the truth of what is going on inside us and out. This does directly decrease slavery to desire and the wishful thinking that comes with it. But it wouldn't have killed them to say something like this: if you show the same pattern of forgetting we have, come join us for a session of sincere and good-natured mutual nagging. In fact, virtually everything we do around here serves to protect us against our alcoholic addict memories. Starting the day with recovery readings and prayer or meditation, identifying out loud as, quote, alcoholics, or whatever the addiction is, whatever the 12-step program, and cheering one another for it, telling our stories over and over, working with newcomers. That's a real booster shot. Seeing a living and breathing reminder of exactly what awaits us if we take that first drink or drug or whatever. Even working the steps 4 through 9. But we will let George explain how that works in a minute. He's the shrink. That's an unquote of a quote that never happened. So what they do say is if you want to keep it, you've got to give it away. It's a literal truth when it is the memory of your own suffering, the memory that keeps you from taking the first drink or drug and keeps you working at recovery. In effect, you get that there is no such thing for you as permanently getting it. So you keep coming back to get memory refreshed, to make sure you have, quote, sufficient force for the only day that counts, today. The big book mentions a lack of, quote, defense against the first drink, unquote. It does not mention Anna Freud's book, The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense. It came out almost the same year. The authors of the big book were not steeped in theories of the unconscious, probably a good thing in itself. They stuck with what they knew and what worked, even if they could not tell you why. But this is likely why they seem to have made no connection between this powerful insight, the one about memory loss above, and a common alcoholic experience they describe a few chapters later. A Jekyll and Hyde alcoholic reacting to the nightmare, that's their word, of memories flooding in as he comes off a spree. The quote goes, as fast as he can, he pushes them deep inside, those nightmare memories. It is these memories of outlandish behavior which happen when the thinking brain has been put to sleep that he seeks to quash. Well, what do you suppose happens to memories when we push them deep inside? We forget them. And once we forget our shameful memories of use, we have little motivation to avoid drinking, using, whatever again. Not only do we not seek reminders, we avoid them. They make us feel bad. This is where AA's focus on the decision to pick up the first drink is so important. And it is where I get to tell one of my favorite Navy stories. The USS Anonymity, it's not the ship's real name, was tied up at a fuel pier in San Pedro, California, commissioned 10 days before I was, in 1969, and long since melted for razor blades. She sat in a thick fog that day in the late 60s. The other junior officers and I ate breakfast in the wardroom. About the time we tackled the stack of donuts that came with coffee, Lieutenant X made an entrance. Now, Lieutenant X was what you call a Mustang. Someone who spent many years as a bosun's mate before getting a limited commission as an officer. He was one of the Navy's leading experts on refueling at sea. Ships like the Anonymity fed oil and bombs and ice cream to other ships using cables and hoses. Lieutenant X was built out of wire and wore wire-rimmed glasses and a look of constipation. He was my boss. If there was one thing he hated in the whole world, it was a college boy who got commissioned without learning how to tie a knot. That would be me. So he made his entrance that morning and announced that he was going to tell the captain not to get underway. I think he snatched a donut before he left. Sure enough, the PA system crackled and the captain announced, "I have decided not to get underway today." My fellow junior officers fell for it. "Why do we have a captain?" they lamented. "Lieutenant X runs the ship." No. Lieutenant X did not run the ship or make that decision. All he had to do was look outside and know what any right-thinking captain would do. He knew what the captain would decide because he knew the two things that go into any decision: desire and information. The captain had a supreme and pressing desire to keep the ship out of harm. And the captain could look out the window too. But what if the captain forgot? What if he had dementia and forgot what he had seen outside before making that decision? What if he'd forgot all he had been taught about the hazards of fog and his responsibility as a captain? What if all he could think about was the bliss of standing on the bridge of his ship underway and barking out orders that no one could refuse? What sort of impaired decision might he have made? What sort of disaster might he have brought on himself and his entire crew? And what sort of decision can any addict or alcoholic make when the most important information, the suffering that got him or her to quit in the first place, has been mysteriously deleted, scrubbed, or overwritten? I hope you see why Lieutenant X was one of my most important teachers and why I'm sharing him with you. It would be many years before I saw the sinister relationship between two addictive realities, between the special kind of desire that poses as need, craving, and the process of fading memory that is relapse. It appears to be the nature of all craving, mental or physical, to get rid of anything that gets in its way. And the biggest barrier to craving during abstinence is reality, the truth, especially the victim's awareness of what will really happen if craving has its way. The thought or opportunity to drink, drug, whatever, should trigger the opening of a particular folder in the mind, the one called memory of suffering and humiliation. Instead, The folder that opens is labeled Good Times. Brain science may explain why our experience is least available when we most need it. A bunch of drunks figured out the workaround before this old geezer was even born, before brain science knew there was any such thing as a neurotransmitter. I have never been able to see alcohol itself, or any drug or fix, as, to use the big book phrase, cunning, powerful, and baffling. A fix is something from outside that cannot get inside without my deciding to put it there. Craving, on the other hand, squats in our brain. It shapes our perception, thought, and emotion so that our decision seems reasonable and inevitable. Of course one won't hurt. How could it? Or, just look what they've done to me. Absolutely anybody would drink too. F it. In this sense, craving is as cunning, powerful, and baffling as any biblical demon ever thought of being. That was biblical. Biblical demon ever thought of being. And all our brain science so far validates just how true that is. Check this out against your own experience. When you are dry and someone or something reminds you of any of your past adventures, how do you react? With anger, anxiety, depression, shame? And I'm not talking about the delusional joy of war stories shared between two addicts who are about to go back out. And what do steps 4 through 9 do? They take our worst memories and strip them of their shame, even turning them into gifts we are eager to share with newcomers, responsees, or both. We will no longer regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it. That's one of the step 9 promises in AA, but it applies to all step work. Talk about transformation. If you've worked steps 4 through 9, compare that to your own experience. If not, ask those who have. How else can some speakers share the things they do? A woman squatting in the middle of the road to pee while drunk. A man waking up in bed with a woman twice his age, his sister-in-law, or another man. Really? Sharing that with 200 people? In reality, few people start to work the steps for the first time with the conscious idea of solving their memory problem. But the heartfelt sense of powerlessness, what is sometimes called the gift of desperation, seems to be fueled, at least in part, by identifying, by feeling the urgent necessity to remember, even if that feeling has not yet found words. If you feel that reality and your own life is at stake, sooner or later, these words will leap off the page. Quote, for the third time, we are unable at certain times to bring into memory with sufficient force. If you get this, you will seek reminding. If you do not get it, you will say things like, this is a whole string of quotes by people that don't get it. I can do anything I set my mind to. I have willpower. Where there's a will, there's a way. Nothing could get me to drink or drug or whatever again. Relapse is a conscious decision. Those meetings are boring. They just keep repeating the same stuff over and over. And you won't seek the step and book studies that share the solution. Those people make AA their whole life. I don't have time for all those meetings. Of course, you may not say or even think these things. It could just be part of your identity. Too smart, too controlled to need all this help. And you will act accordingly. Why wouldn't you? How could you act any differently? This is your reality. Those in recovery who understand the memory problem will get this and say things like these. Keep coming back. Meeting makers make it. We have built-in forgetters. I have this memory problem. I still come to meetings as insurance 20, 30, 40 years later. Nothing helps so much as working with newcomers. In other words, these folks realize the threat of fading recall. They recognize that their memory of the suffering and humiliation is so weak it is possible to believe yet again, one won't hurt, this time will be different, no one will know, I can handle it now. However, once they face this reality, the threat of a weak memory itself ignites the willingness to do the work of self-protection, to pick up the tools the program offers for keeping it green. That's a phrase I heard in Boston about 20 years ago. As you may already see, all 8 of our slices assume nothing gets done without the willingness to do it. 1 down, 7 to go. P.S. The federal government spent almost $30 million on addiction research in the late 90s, just to see if they could match 3 different kinds of treatment to specific kinds of alcoholic patients, to see what worked best for each group. 12-step facilitation, TSF, was 50% more effective than cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and at the end of the study, those still staying sober had one primary thing in common, whether treated by TSF or CBT or a third method. They were going to AA meetings. In other words, the federal government spent almost $30 million to prove that, quote, meeting makers make it, unquote. Okay, so that's the end of the chapter 2, the one called Oops, I Forgot. It's about the memory problem and the importance of getting that and what you will or won't do, depending on whether you do or don't get it, regardless of which addiction you may have, including the process addictions. And I think I will sign off at this point and see if I can get this uploaded effectively to YouTube.